Hello friends, welcome to the ninth session titled Public-Private Partnerships for Infrastructure Financing. Having discussed the meaning of infrastructure, its importance for economic development, status of rural and urban infrastructure in India, urbanization and massive investment requirements for infrastructure in general and urban infrastructure in particular, and the approaches for financing of infrastructure in earlier 8 sessions. In this session, we would discuss adoption of public-private partnership, meaning of public-private partnership, enabling environment for public-private partnership for infrastructure, investment, leveraging public-private partnership for various infrastructure sectors. Majority of the governments of rapidly urbanizing countries are unable to serve the increasing infrastructure demand because of their constrained budgetary resources. Hence, private sector is being associated in the delivery of infrastructure and public services. 1994 World Bank report on infrastructure for development highlighted physical constraints on traditional sources of funds for infrastructure as one of the major reasons, amongst others like poor performance of public sector management of infrastructure, technological advancements and know-how with private players, and innovations in financial instruments have led to upsurge in private financing of infrastructure. India's Economic Survey 2006-07 had reported that exclusive dependence on government for provision of all infrastructure services introduces difficulties of adequate investment, technical efficiency, proper enforcement of user charges and competitive market structure. Simultaneously, complete reliance on private production without appropriate regulations is not likely to produce optimal outcomes. Gary Bond and Lawrence Carter in 1994 suggested 3 approaches for private sector involvement. These range from complete government ownership of resources, that is government monopoly, to handling over the resources to private sector, that is private competitive environment. These range from deregulation and unbundling, divestiture, and finally fully privatization and unbundling. Privatization involves outright sale of public service or utility to the private sector. Literature on public-private partnership is relatively new, though the concept is not new, as reviewed by Grimsey and Lewis in 2005. France is the founder of public-private partnerships, as first concession contracts were awarded for the construction of canals in 1638 and 1966. Later in the second half of the 19th century, public-private partnership was extensively used for its railways, water, electricity and tramways. Evolution of public-private partnership accelerated in United Kingdoms as privatization process brought different mechanisms for delivery of public services. It evolved differently in United States, where they embraced policy level partnerships, highway assistance programs and project level partnerships, that is private toll roads. Public-private partnership approach for infrastructure development relied upon heavily in developed countries including Australia, Canada and United Kingdoms. Now, public-private partnership is growing in United States also. Examples of them were Fast Tracks commuter and light rail project in Colorado 2004, Bayou Water Joint Venture LCC project New Jersey 2012, the Goethals Bridge linking New York and New Jersey 2014. Public-private partnership is defined as arrangement between a government and a private sector in which partially or traditionally public activities are performed by the private sector. Public-private partnership is commonly used in 2 different ways. One arrangement being the public and private sectors join together to produce and deliver goods and services. Alternative arrangement being a long-term contractual partnerships between the public and private sector agencies specifically targeted towards financing, designing, implementing and operating infrastructure facilities and services traditionally being provided by public sector. In public-private partnership, the collaborative arrangement of private sector brings technical and managerial expertise, improves operational efficiency, infuses financial resources, bears construction, commercial and operational risks of the project and introduces competitiveness. Public-private partnership does not reduce responsibility and accountability of the government as it remains accountable for services, quality, price, certainty and cost effectiveness. Government's role gets redefined to that of a facilitator and enabler. It contributes assurance in terms of stable governance, citizen support, financing and also assumes social, environmental and political risks. Private sector plays the role of financier, builder and operator of services. Public-private partnership as long-term contract involves complex planning relating to risk management, cost recovery, tariff fixation, construction, financial planning and regulatory policy and governance issues. For example, for the upgradation and modernization of Delhi Airport, Delhi International Airport Limited, a joint venture consortium was formed as a private limited company through a global competitive bidding. Members of the joint venture included GMR as a lead member and Airport Authority of India. Public-private partnership contracts have the features as collaborative framework for the sharing of both responsibility and risks involved, focus on service received by the government, long-term relationships, high trust relationship, whole of the life costing, innovation, risk allocation. Public-private partnership arrangement is flexible. As per the World Bank data, public-private partnership may take any of the following 6 forms. First being service contract, wherein specific services associated with infrastructure are contracted to a private firm for specific time period in return for a management fee. Second being management contract, which is similar to service contract, but the private party has overall responsibility for operating and maintaining the system and makes the day-to-day decisions. However, it does not assume any capital risks. Third being lease, wherein private entity is given a long-term lease to develop and operate on expanded facility. The entity pays lease rental to the government and keeps the revenue to recover its investment plus a reasonable return over the term of the lease and bears the investment and operational risks. Example, Delhi Airport leased to GMR and Mumbai Airport leased to GYR. Fourth being concession, which is BOT, BOOT. This is similar to lease and it's commonly used public-private partnership model. Under BOOT, the concessionaire gets ownership rights of the land and other assets for the concession period, and on expiry of the contract period, the ownership of the facility is transferred to the government. This is preferred by the concessionaire as it enhances her or his creditworthiness and she or he is able to raise funds at relatively low interest. Fifth being greenfield projects, wherein private entity or public-private partnership joint venture builds and operates a new facility for the period specified in the project contract. The facility is returned to the government at the end of the concession period. The government usually provides revenue guarantee through long-term take or pay contract for bulk supply facilities or minimum traffic revenue guarantees. Sixth being divestiture, which is BOO, in which government transfers the ownership of existing assets to a private entity through an asset sale, public offering or mass private privatization program and later has full responsibility for maintenance of the assets. It cannot be a part of PPP. The 5 principles of public-private partnership are: private capital only is not sufficient for the success of public-private partnership. Commercial viability only is not sufficient for success of public-private partnership. Project development is the name of the game. Risk transfer is the aim of the game. Last P of partnership is the most important, requiring institutional, policy and legal frameworks for cooperation. India's economy experienced a period of rapid economic growth during the first decade of 21st century, and need for infrastructure investment became priority. India's average GDP growth during the 12th five-year plan was 7% because of the GST and demonetization, while it was 8% during the 11th five-year plan. During 10th five-year plan, average GDP growth rose to 7.6% from 5.5% of the 9th five-year plan. To maintain this growth, it was essential to keep same pace in augmenting and enhancing the capacity of economic infrastructure. Government of India became aware of the inability to fund large infrastructure need and an associated funding gap by approaching end of the 20th century. Simultaneously, having accepted the importance of private resources, both human and finances, in infrastructure, Government of India adopted a strategy for encouraging private investment in infrastructure through public-private partnership. The 11th five-year plan estimated spending of rupees 24 lakh crore to overcome infrastructure bottlenecks, and about 30% of it was envisaged to be made by the private sector. The government further envisaged that by the end of 11th five-year plan, the investment of infrastructure would increase to 8% of GDP, and investment from private sources would contribute about 1.2% of the GDP, which was only 0.9% of GDP in late 90s. Under Union Budget 2019-20, US dollars 63.20 billion was allocated to the sector. According to the Department of Industrial Policy and Promotion, construction development sector and infrastructure activity sector received foreign direct investment inflows amounting to US dollar 24.90 billion and US dollar 13.49 billion respectively from April 2000 to September 2018. The current rate of infrastructure investment is still not sufficient and could become a serious brake on India's economic expansion and rising income levels. It is imperative to revitalize the public-private partnerships for providing an impetus to the infrastructure investment. Worldwide scenario of infrastructure investments is also grim. The world invested about $2.5 trillion per year in economic infrastructure, that is transportation, power, water, telecom systems in 2015. Yet, this amount continues to fall short of world's ever-expanding needs, which results in lower economic growth and deprives citizens of essential services. MGI's report Bridging Infrastructure Gap 2016 presets the world's updated infrastructure needs as well as projected investment shortfalls. It recommends bridging those gaps in context of public-private partnership. From 2016 to 2030, the world needs to invest about 3.8% of GDP or an average of USD 3.3 trillion per year in economic infrastructure just to support expected rates of growth. Emerging economies account for some 60% of that need. But if the current trajectory of underinvestment continues, the world will fall short by roughly 11% or USD 350 billion per year. The gap triples if the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals to be achieved. Corporate finance makes up about 3/4 of the private finance, Unleashing investment in privatized sectors requires regulatory certainty and the ability to change prices that produce an acceptable risk-adjusted return, as well as enablers such as spectrum or land access, permits and approvals. Public-private partnerships have assumed a greater role in infrastructure, although there is continued controversy about whether they deliver higher efficiency and lower costs. Either way, they will continue to be an important source of financing in the future. But since they account for only about 5 to 10% of total investment, they are unlikely to provide that support that will solve the funding gap. Public and corporate investment remain much larger issues. With this, we come to an end of session 9.